Good day, guys. Welcome to another episode of my Python programming series. My name is Eliaza, and you are watching EA Lego Academy. So, before we start, just want to do a recap of what we did in our last video. We talked about user input and while loops, and we saw how we could be able to work with data structures using while loops. So, today, we are going to be looking at functions. So, before we proceed, if you feel like this video is going to be of use to you, please, I want you to subscribe, and you can like this video in advance before we start because I only produce quality content. And please share if you feel this video would be of use or of importance to your friends and families. All right, so without further ado, let's dive into this. All right, so what we want to look at functions, what functions are. So now the definition, now this is me paraphrasing because most of the time when we treat technical concepts, in order for a layman to understand or someone new to the topic being discussed, we always paraphrase so that they can understand. So functions, so these are containers that hold one or more lines of code written to execute a program. We have two types of functions, which are inbuilt and user-defined functions. So in our past videos, we have treated inbuilt functions. So when we looked at the list data structure, if you can remember, we looked at the append function, the insert, the pop, the del, the remove. So all these are functions. And of course, the list is a class. The list data structure is a class. So when you create a variable and you assign it a square bracket that has multiple elements in it, we can say that that variable is an implicit representation of the list class. So the list data structure is actually a class that has functions. So we can say that functions are containers that are kept in bigger containers that allow us to hold multiple functions. Don't worry, this concept and this definition is going to get clearer when we look at object-oriented programming. So as to not sound overwhelming, functions are just containers that allow us to hold multiple lines of code written together to execute a program in layman's terms. So let's look at how we can define a function. So a function is defined or created using the def keyword followed by any name of your choice, provided the name doesn't start with a number and there are no white spaces separating it. So the same principle and the same modus operandi for you to create, the same modus operandi needed for you to create a variable is the same way you are going to use to give a function a name. So, but before you write the name of the function, you want to write def. So def is a keyword. It's an inbuilt. So keywords are statements. Statements are functions. Statements are functions without a parenthesis. If you can remember when we looked at the del statement. So if you can't remember, go back to my video where I talked about the list data structure. Yeah, so I explained that explicitly. So you write the def keyword, then you give a space and followed by the name of your function. So the name of your function follows the same naming convention that we use in creating variables. So you can give it any name provided that that name does not start with a number or there are no white spaces separating the name. So a function is defined or created using the def keyword followed by any name of your choice, provided the name doesn't start with a number and there are no white spaces separating it. So that's just it. This is how we define a function. So let's look at passing information to a function. So this is when we create a variable in the parenthesis of a function and we use that variable to execute a program. We can see this below. Now, this is not exactly the definition. When we say passing information to a function, it means that you create a function irrespective of whether the function has a variable in its parenthesis or not, as long as that function has code in its body. And we can see the body here by this indentation created after the def keyword on a new line. So whatever you write here is the same thing as me passing information to this function. So whether or not this function has a variable in its parenthesis or not, we can still say that we are passing information to this function. Just hold on a minute. I want to ensure that I'm recording the video. Okay, so we're going to write this. So now the function I will write would not have a variable in the parenthesis. I will explain what we call variables written in the parenthesis of a function when you are creating that function. So open your PyCharm, come to the name of your folder, right click. I'm sure we know how to do this. So right click, click on new, come down here to Python file, and you can just call it functions, function, function program. I'll just use camel case. So camel case is when you write a variable, name with small letter, or you combine two names together as a single variable, whereby the first letter of the first name is in small letter, but the first letter of the second name is in capital letter. So that's what we call camel case. The first letter of the first name is small letter, but the first letter of the second name is capital letter. So I will create a function to let me increase the size so that you can see what I am doing. I will create a function called exhibit. Doesn't really matter. Now you put a colon at the front, then you press enter, then you automatically get an indentation. So all these conventions are being observed because we are in PyCharm. So PyCharm was specifically created to identify Python syntax. So I will just print out a message that says hello world. Hello world. So now in order for me to execute this function, I would need to write the function name again. Now the process of you writing a function name again in order to execute the code within that function is referred to as a function call. So I can come here and say exhibit, and the moment I press play, it will print out hello world to the screen. So you change it to current file, click on play, and then you get hello world printed out to your screen. So that's what we mean by a function call. So this is my own function name. Now inside the function, this is what I'm trying to execute. In order for it to be executed, I will have to write the function name again, and then it will now print out hello world. All right, so let's continue. So we're going to come here anyway. I didn't explain this deliberately because I would want to define it first. Then we will now know the reason why we created a variable in the parenthesis of the function. So the next thing we're looking at is arguments and parameters. So let's define what arguments are. So arguments are values we assign to variables created in the parenthesis of a function during this function's execution. So the value that you assign to a variable that was created in the parenthesis of a function when you created that function, we assign that value during the function call or function execution. So when I say function call, it's the same thing as me saying function execution. Okay. So now let me go back to this function and explain. Now, this is my function called first. This is a parameter. I will explain that down. I will define it down. But let me just paraphrase and summarize what I'm trying to say. Now, this is an argument. So an argument is a value you assign to a variable that was written in the parentheses of a function during that function's creation. So when I created the function, in order for me to execute this function, when I created the function and I passed this variable in its parentheses, when I'm trying to execute this function, the value I assign to that variable is called an argument. I hope that makes sense in a layman's way. So let's look at parameters now. So that variable that I was talking about here, name, is now what we refer to as a parameter. So these are variables written in the parentheses of a function during that function's creation. So when you create a function and you write a variable in the parentheses of that function, that variable is referred to as a parameter. Now, the reason why we call it a parameter is because we are using it in the parentheses of the function while it is being created. The reason why we are not calling it a variable, I will give you an example. Let's say we have a program that we have a variable called name, just as an example, and then we have another variable in the parentheses of that function called name. Then of course we write code and then we use it to make a sentence. Now maybe the code was written in a book, just as an example. Maybe the code was written in a book. Now if the author of the book says something like the variable is now assigned a value, or the variable is now used to make a sentence, that will confuse you. So if we are referring to the variable in the parentheses of that function during its creation as a variable, and we are also referring to the variable standing on its own as a variable, you as the reader would not be able to differentiate which variable the author is talking about. So that's why Python created naming conventions. Python decided to call variables written in the parentheses of a function parameters. So Python calls variables written in the parentheses of a function parameters. It calls them parameters so that you would know which variable it's talking about. So I hope that makes sense. So now you can see that here I created a function called argfunct, and this function has a parameter in its parentheses, and I'm using that parameter to make a sentence. So to print out hello there, this. So now when I execute the function, I passed an argument in its parentheses. Now that argument, which is of course a value, it is the value assigned to this parameter. Python is going to use that value to make this sentence. So this will print out hello there, James. So let's write the code for that. So you just comment this out. So this one is passing information to a function, passing information to function. Now this one is the next one is arguments and parameters. So you want to comment this one out so that do not cause problems. So arguments and parameters. Yeah. So I'll just create a function called running, and I'll just give it a parameter as name. And you can come here and make a sentence. I'll just use if the format method. I'll say run so fast. So I'm using name to make a sentence. So I'll come here and pass David. So if I should print this out, you will discover that it will print out David ran so fast. Right, so that's what we get. So let's continue. So now we want to look at the different types of arguments that we can have. So we can actually have different types of arguments. Different types. Now the first one is positional arguments. So these are values that are assigned to a parameter of a function that has no value. We can see it in the program below. All right, so now I want to address something. So it's very possible for a parameter written in the parentheses of a function during its creation to actually have a value. It's very possible. So now when we say a positional argument, it's a value that we assign to a parameter of a function that does not have any value. So those parameters that do not have a value, who we are going to assign values to during the function's execution, are referred to as parameters that are assigned positional arguments. So now this parameter called name does not have a value. I did not assign it a value. Neither does age here have a value. But when I executed the function, I assigned Adam to name and I assigned 34 to age. So what I will do, I will just type something similar to this. So we know what parameters are and we know what arguments are. So arguments are values that we assign to parameters during the function's execution. Okay. So now I will create a function called executable. Doesn't really matter. Give it any name you want. So I will just come here and say h1, or rather score and school. I can make a sentence here. I will use my format method. I will say Adam had a score of, and he goes to format. So I'll just put score here and I will put school. So now during the function's execution, you can just come outside here, indent, and then write executable. Now pass score, so 87, and I'll pass Oxford. Okay. So when I execute this program, you will discover that it will print out Adam had a score of 87 and he goes to Oxford. So you see we have that precisely. So now you can see that here during the function's execution, the position in which I wrote the parameter, that will be the exact same position I will write the argument. So because I wrote score first, when I'm passing an argument, I will need to write 87. And because I wrote school second, when I'm passing the second argument, I will need to write Oxford or something that matches with school. So you can see that the position in which my parameters were passed, that will be the position in which I will write my arguments. So the fact that the arguments take the position of each parameter created in the parentheses of that function, that's the reason why we call them positional arguments. So we call them positional arguments because they take the positions of the parameters created in the parentheses of the function. I hope that makes sense. All right, so now the next one is keyword arguments. So these are values already assigned to parameters in the parentheses of a function while that function is being created. This is shown below. So to clear the air, when I say parentheses, I mean this kind of brackets. Some people call them brackets, but they are called parentheses. And when I say square bracket, I mean this. I mean this. So parentheses, I mean this. Square brackets, I mean this. Then when I say curly brackets or braces, I mean this. So these are the different names we call them. These are the different names we call them. Hope that's clear. All right, so keyword arguments. Keyword arguments. These are values already assigned to parameters in the parentheses of a function while that function is being created. This is shown below. So we can see that here we have a function called keyfunct, and that function has a parameter called score, and I assigned an argument or a value to that parameter. So for the fact that I didn't have to wait before I executed the function in order to give it a value, It means that that value that I assigned to the parameter while I created the function name is referred to as a keyword argument. That's just it. That's just the simple definition. Arguments you assign to parameters while you created them in the parentheses of a function without you having to execute the function. So they are referred to as keyword arguments. So now you can see that here I'm making a sentence with that parameter, with the argument of that parameter, and all I will need to do is just to write the function name again in order to execute the value or the argument that was assigned to that parameter. All right, so now there's something that you need to note. When you are mixing positional and keyword arguments together, keyword arguments cannot come before positional arguments. If you do so, you will get an error. So positional arguments always come before keyword arguments, or rather parameters that would be assigned positional arguments always come before parameters that will or would be assigned keyword arguments. So that's that. So let us quickly write code on that. So keyword argument, this one was positional, positional, positional arguments, and then the next one is keyword arguments. So keyword arguments. So data set. You have so I'm out of names. I can just say score course. Doesn't really matter. Anything. So score course. So I mix keyword arguments anyway. Equal to 84 and then course equal to. So it's possible to write two keyword arguments at the same time. It's possible, provided you're not writing a keyword before a positional. So you study course and your score course. So now this will print out you study physics and your score was 84. I didn't call the function. So you want to call the function, you just come outside here and call the function. So now because I've already given those parameters arguments, there would be no need for me to write an argument again in the parentheses. Just click on execute and you get you study physics and your score was 84. All right, so the next one is default values. So this is when we mix a positional argument with a keyword argument in a function. Actually, a default value is when it's just similar to a keyword argument. So it means that you are giving a parameter, an argument, the moment you created it in the parentheses of a function. You don't have to wait to execute that function before you give that parameter an argument. So that's what a default value means. But we are seeing how we can mix a positional and a keyword argument together. So that's what I'm going to do next. So mixing positional and keyword arguments. So just comment this out. Comment it out. All right, mixing positional and keyword arguments together. I'll just create a function called Android. Now I can just see Google, YouTube. So now you'll notice that if I decide to give it value or That is, assign it a value while I created it, maybe Google. You will discover that it's underlining the other. So PyCharm already allows you to check for errors even before you execute your code. So PyCharm allows you nip errors in the board before they escalate. So now if you hover your mouse over it, you would see the error it tells you. It tells you non-default parameter follows default parameter. So the default parameter is, of course, our keyword argument, and I'm writing a non-default parameter after. So I already explained that to you. I said the default parameter is the same thing as a keyword argument. So you see that we get an error. So you cannot write a keyword argument before a positional argument. You want to write the keyword argument after the positional argument. So I make a sentence. Say is a brand under the format. Just pass YouTube, comma, Google. So now when you run this code, you would have YouTube is a brand under Google. So click play. Oh, I forgot to call my function again. So you want to call your function and just say Android. I'll just pass Google. So to print out Google is a brand, also YouTube is a brand under Google. So you can comment it out. All right, so the next one we're looking at, so that we won't waste time. Let's look at equivalent function call. So this is when we execute or call a function in two different ways which are the same. So we try to execute a function in two ways that mean the same thing. So this is demonstrated below. So I'm going to write, or I'm going to call my function in two ways that practically mean the same thing. So equivalent function call. So what I would do, so that I won't waste time typing the same redundant code, I will just copy this, copy it, and paste it. So now you notice that I will call my function the first time, and I will come here and call it again. This time around, I will just supply the parameter name and I will assign it a value. So now you will discover that this will print out the same sentence twice. This will print out the same sentence twice. So here I just only specify that this argument called Google is assigned to a parameter called Google as well. So that's it. So if you execute your code, you would see that you have the same sentence printed out twice. So that is what we refer to as equivalent function call. Now the next thing we're looking at is return values. So the return value is a keyword that converts a function to a variable that has been assigned a value. So now this is just an overtly simplified definition of the return statement or value. So, but what it does, it gives us the ability to execute a program without printing it out. That's what it does. So the return value gives us the ability to execute a program without printing it out. So this gives us the ability to execute a program without printing it out. But of course, it also makes a function like a variable. Not that the function becomes a variable, but it allows us to use a function like a variable. So this definition is overtly simple. Let's not state things that are not true in Python. The return value is a keyword that allows us allows us to treat a function like a variable, a variable who has been assigned, a variable which has been assigned, which has been assigned a value. So it allows us to treat a function like a variable that has been assigned a value. Just very, very succinct. Or it gives us the ability to execute a program without printing it out. That's just the definition. So that's the only way you can understand it to me. There might be other definitions that say otherwise, but something similar to this. But this is the idea. This is the idea of the return statement. It treats a function like a variable that has been assigned a value, or it allows us to execute a program in a function without printing it out. So what I will do, I will create a function called data manager. Now this function will not have any parameter. You can give it a parameter, but let's just give it a parameter. I will say name, and I will just come here and say return greetings there, Mr. Show dot format. So now you will notice that if I should call this function data manager and pass a value, you will discover that nothing would get executed. So nothing gets executed. Why? Because the function is being treated like a variable that has been assigned a value. So what it is returning, the value it is returning is treated as that value that has been assigned to the variable, which is the function name. But that it's not that the function is a variable. It just treats the function like that, like as if it's a variable. But the function is not a variable. So in order for you to see the value that this function is returning, you would need to come here and say print. Then you want to encapsulate it within the parentheses. So it will now print out greetings there, Mr. Alex. When you execute your program, that's when you have this sentence printed out. I hope that makes sense. Hope it's clear. All right. So now the next thing we're looking at here is making an argument optional. So you can decide to make an argument optional. So we said this is when we choose to assign a new value to a keyword argument or not during a function call. Or we can modify this definition and say that this is when we choose to assign a new value to a keyword, or this is when we choose to assign a new value to a parameter to a parameter that has been given an empty string, or that has been assigned an empty string that has been assigned an empty string as its value. So this is when we choose to assign a new value to a parameter that has been assigned an empty string as its value, or not as its value, or not during a function execution. So this is when we choose to assign a new value to a parameter that has been assigned an empty string as its value or not during a function execution. So we're going to have a parameter that we assigned an empty string as its value. Then we can now choose to either assign a new value to that parameter or not. So that's what this definition is trying to say. Now, if you can remember, before we write the code, or let's go to our PyCharm and let's see how we can work with this. So what's the title? Making an argument optional. So you want to comment this out first. So making an argument optional. So now if you can remember, we have some conventions in Python that I stated. Some conventions. If you can still remember, I said when we create a variable and assign it an empty string, Python sees it as a false value. When you create a variable and assign it a value that has something within its quotation, Python sees it as a true value. When you create a variable and assign it an empty list, Python sees it as a false value. And when you create a variable and assign it a list that has elements, Python sees it as a true value. Yeah. So now, having said that, let me explain this code. So we can see that here we had three parameters. Now the last parameter was given a keyword argument. Now based on what I've said, that when we assign an empty string to a parameter or a variable, that variable is seen as a false value. Now if I choose not to assign an argument to this parameter during the function call, if I should use a conditional statement or if I should create a conditional statement with it, it will be seen as a false value. So now let's assume that I haven't assigned any argument for this third parameter. I just leave it like that as an empty string. This would automatically make it a false value. So this condition would simply be if false. And of course, we know that when a condition is false, the program within that condition does not get executed. And we know that if we had an else statement around the corner, that the else statement is waiting for that condition of the if statement to be false. So if I choose not to assign an argument to this parameter here, Python would come here and execute the code within the else block. But if I decide to assign an argument to this parameter, which I did, Smith, then Python will proceed to validate this condition as if true, and it will proceed to execute this code. So if now I assigned an argument to the parameter Smith, so Python will execute the code within the if block. So it will print out hello there, Jack, Smith, Alex. So that is what I'm returning. So I'm returning the value that was assigned to this variable, full name. And of course, since I'm returning something, I would need to use the print sentence or the print function first, sorry, before I can execute this function. So I will need to say print, then write the function in the parentheses. All right, so let's quickly do that. I will just come here, create a function, call it information. Just see its age score course. So I'll just give it an empty string here. I'll come here and say if course. I'll just say return directly. Return. Hey there, you scored this one. You you are you you are and you study. I just come here and say the format score age course. All right, so now this will happen. This will happen if I actually give an argument to course during the function call. But if I don't give an argument to course, it will execute what is inside the else. Else, return. You are and you score So now I'll just show you how you can execute it using both of them. So now during the function call, I can come here and say information. So I can pass values for age, maybe 34, and score 88. So I'm only passing for the two parameters. I didn't pass for the third one. So you will discover that this first execution would execute what is inside the else block. Why? Because at that point in time, I did not supply a value for course. So that condition, the if condition, is going to be false. So Python will execute what is inside the else. But for the second execution of the function, if I come here and I pass maybe 33, 91, and I pass physics, you will discover that Python for the second execution would execute the code within the if statement or the if block. So by that time, I've supplied an actual value for course, validating this convention that we talked about, whereby if you assign a value, an actual literal value that has characters within the quotation mark, Python sees it as a true value. So it will now be true and Python will execute this. So you will discover that for the first execution, we're going to have what we have in the else block, and for the second execution, we're going to have what we have in the if block. So you can see that it printed out you are 34 and you scored 88. This was what was in the else block. And then for this other sentence, we had, hey there, you scored 91, you are 33 and you study physics. So this was inside the if block. So that's how you can um, write that, execute that code. So it was under making an argument optional. So let's look at how we can return a dictionary. So we know what the return statement does for us. So we want to see how we can use it for a dictionary. So here you can see that I have a dictionary that has 4 parameters. Now these 4 parameters would be given positional arguments during the function call. And at the same time, these parameters here, they are acting as keys and values within a dictionary. So the first parameter is acting as the first key. The value of that, sorry, the first parameter is acting as the first key in the dictionary. The second parameter is acting as the value of that key. The third parameter is acting as the second key. And the fourth parameter is acting as the value of the second key. So here, you just come here, create a function, run. In the parentheses, you can write. So I'll just write like the same thing. So I will say name val, age, age val. I'm out of code in my head, so you can just freestyle and write your own code. It's the same principle, provided they follow the same convention. So you say name is equal to name val, say code age equal to age val. So now in the function call, you just come here and say print run, and you pass your argument. So name Alex, age 33. So now if you execute this, you will discover that it will print out a dictionary with 2 key value pairs. Okay, did I print it out? I'm coming. So I didn't return it. So you come here, you see now the reason why you had none is because we did not return any value. So it knows that that function does not return anything. So you are printing out a value, you are printing out from a function that has not returned a value. So we only get none when we are printing out from a function that does not have a return value. That's when we have none. All right, I hope that makes sense. So I'll come here and say hold, then it will print out the key and value pairs in that dictionary. All right, so that's how we can return a dictionary. So now let's look at using a function with a while loop. So now we can combine the use of a function and a while loop together. We can combine their use together. So here you can see that I created a function, and this function has two parameters here. So when I call now, in order for me to execute what this function is returning, of course, you know that you will need to use the print sentence to print out the value that would be returned by the function. Now, you will see that here I use an F string to read the value stored in these two parameters. Now, I created a while loop, and of course, we know how the while loop runs. It continuously runs over and over and over again till is a condition is either satisfied or till a condition is false. And I think I explained when we can verify or validate either of these definitions. Now here, this while loop will continuously run until a condition is satisfied. That's when this while loop will stop, when a condition is satisfied. So now while true, now it will start, and then you would get prompted to enter first value. Now, when you enter a value, it would assign that value as a value of this variable first. Now, it will now check if you typed quit as the value of the variable. If you typed quit as the value of this variable, it will break out of the while loop and not start again or not proceed. So it will not proceed to the next step. But if what you typed is not quit, it will proceed to the next step, prompting you to enter a value for this second variable called second. Now, if you typed quit here, it will break out of the while loop. But if you did not type quit, it will proceed and make a sentence with the two values you assigned to first and second. Now, those two values you assigned to first and second would act as positional arguments for these two parameters in this function you created. Now, you notice that I'm calling the function here names. I'm calling it within this print sentence. So what? And because this function just prints out these two values like that without making a sentence with them, also likewise, whatever I assign to first and second would also be printed out like that, since that is what this function is returning. So they will be printed out like that, and this sentence would be attached to them, would be prefixed before them. So we're going to have hello there, whatever values you assigned to first and second. So I think I've explained that properly. I don't want to waste time typing the code. You can just copy here, copy down, and paste it in your PyCharm and execute the code. So I think that will save me some time. So the explanation and the writing of code, I think that is what makes this video very lengthy. So I think moving forward, all I would do is just explain the code, copy, and I'll paste. And I'm sure. But if you guys don't prefer that method, if you don't like it, let me know in the comment section, and I will revert back to my usual way. But the only reason why moving forward, what I would do is that I will explain the code explicitly, and I will copy the code and paste and execute so that you can see the result. But if you like my previous method of typing my code down, then you can just leave a comment in the comment section and I will adhere to it. So of course this video is for my fans and for my subscribers. So whatever you guys like, just let me know. All right, so if I should execute this code, you will discover that it will prompt me to enter a value. So I will enter value Daniel, and it would assign that value to first. I can enter another value Alex. Now the moment I click enter, it would make a sentence with these two names that I assigned to first and second, and then it would immediately prompt me to enter values again all over. So the while loop would execute the code and keep on repeating itself until I type quit. So you will discover that it does that. When I type quit, it breaks out of the program. So I hope that was clear. It's pretty clear. So you can just comment it out. All right, so now the next thing we would be looking at is passing a list. So let's look at modifying a list in a function. So we said this is when we move elements from one list to another list using a function. So we want to see how we can move elements from one list to another list using a function. If you can remember, we have treated this code in our previous tutorial when we looked at user input and while loop. So if you can remember, we have treated it already. So we said that when a list has elements, when it doesn't. So when it has elements, Python sees it as true. And for as long as that list has elements, it would continuously be true until it doesn't have elements anymore. Now you can see that this this loop, I'm repeating the same program, but this time I'm encapsulating it within a function. And this function has two parameters that would be giving positional arguments during the function's execution. Now, it's still the same thing we did in our last tutorial, in our last episode rather. So here, what I did was that I created two lists and I assigned them to variables. I'm now passing those two lists as arguments to these two parameters. So in the place of val list, I'm going to have a list called value list taking its place so that it will be looping through this value list, removing elements starting from the zero index and adding them to an empty list called empty list. So this other argument here, which is an empty list, is acting as the argument to this parameter called emp list. So it's still the same code. It will make sense for me to type it all over again. Just copy and paste. So I will just copy it and paste it. If you want to type the code, you can pause the video and you can type the code. So it's the exact same thing we did in our previous tutorial when we looked at user input and while loop. So I'll just show you this exact same code so that you would know that we are telling the truth. So looking for my previous code that talked about user input loop. So now scroll up. Now you can see that this was exactly what we treated. You can see that here while contain. So while I am looping through this list that has elements, I want to be removing starting from the zero index and adding them to this empty list. So I'm sure that we can see that we have validated our claim. All right, so when you are done, you comment it out. If you are done writing the code, just comment it out. So I'll just leave it for like 3 seconds for you to comment, for you to type it out yourself. All right, so commenting it out now. So sorry, we didn't run the code. My mistake. So you click on play and then you will discover that it's printing out the list that was previously empty but now has elements, because you can see that here what I returned was the list emp list, which of course represents the list that was empty. So I passed an empty list as its argument. So you can see that that is what I was returning, or I am returning the list that was previously empty but now has elements in it. I hope that is pretty clear. So if it's not clear, you can ask questions in the comment section rather. So let's look at preventing a function from modifying a list. So this is when we copy a list and then we use a function to move elements from the copied list to another list. So you copy a list and then you now use a function to move elements from that copied list to another list, or rather to an empty list. So now it's still the same thing I did, the same code, no difference. Now, if you can remember, when we looked at slicing, you can still remember when we looked at introduction to lists, I talked about slicing And I said that when you don't specify the index position of the first element, you just don't write anything, it assumes that you are starting from the very first element. And when you don't also write where you are heading to, it assumes that you are going to the very last element. So this is the same thing as me accessing this entire list that has elements, and I'm assigning it to a new variable called value list copy. Now it's still the same code I'm going to write, but in place of me writing value list as the first argument of the first parameter in my function, I'm going to instead write the copy, value list copy, as the argument for this parameter val list, so that this while loop would loop through value list copy instead of looping through value list. I hope that makes sense. And you would discover that your value list would still be intact without it being tampered with. So it's still the same code, just copy it and paste, and you will discover that you would have the same thing. So don't forget, I'm still returning back the list that was previously empty but now has elements. So if you execute your code, you will discover that it would give you the list that was previously empty. Now, just to confirm that your value list copy is now empty, you can come here and say print value list copy, and you will discover that it will print out an empty list as well. So you can see that we have an empty list. So it has successfully removed all the elements that were assigned to this variable called value list copy. I hope that makes sense. So when you are done, just comment it out. Now the next thing we want to look at is passing an arbitrary number of arguments. So I won't be wasting time with this. I will be going straight to the point because I'm trying to shorten the times of our video so that my viewers can get encouraged to watch my videos from the start to the end, to the finish. But if you do not agree with this my method, please feel free to engage me and I would revert back to my previous method. So passing an arbitrary number of arguments. So this is when we assign multiple values to one parameter in the parenthesis of a function. The parameter is denoted with an asterisk at the front. All right. So you can see that here I have a parameter called names and I gave it an asterisk. Now this parameter is just the same thing as a variable that is acting as a representation of the tuple class, because when I call the function, I can assign multiple arguments to just that parameter alone. And you will discover that when you execute this code, it will print out Alex, Jones, Sam, and Adam in a parenthesis, not a square bracket. So it's actually a tuple. Parameters that are assigned arbitrary number of arguments are actually representations of the tuple class. I hope that makes sense. So when you copy your code and you paste it, you would discover that it will print out multiple values in a parenthesis. So you can see that it's a tuple, not a list. So that's what we mean by an arbitrary number of arguments. So you can see that arbitrary number. So we don't know the exact number of arguments that we are trying to give a parameter, but they are arbitrary. So they can be as many as you want. But all those arguments are going to be assigned to only one parameter. I hope that makes sense. So if it doesn't, like I said, leave a comment in the comment section. So let's look at mixing positional and arbitrary arguments. So this is when we combine the use of a positional and an arbitrary number of arguments in a single function program. So you can see that here I created a function that mixes a positional and an arbitrary number of arguments together. So I made a sentence with the positional, it mixed two parameters. The first parameter would be assigned a positional argument and the second parameter would be assigned an arbitrary number of arguments. So I'm making a sentence with the first parameter, and the second parameter, since it's acting as a representation of the tuple class, it means that I can loop through it. So this will now carry out a for loop, printing out course chemistry to start again. For the second iteration, we would have course biology, and the third iteration, we would have course psychology, and the fourth, we would have course physics. But for the first one, we're going to have Adam offers the following courses below before we have the loop. So just copy your code and you paste it, and then you would get your result. So you see that we have Adam offers the following courses below, then chemistry, that's course chemistry, course biology, course psychology, course physics. So if you're having a hard time understanding the for loop, go back to my previous video when I talked about working with lists. Working with lists. So I talked explicitly about the for loop. All right, so the next one is using arbitrary keyword arguments. So we said this is when we assign one or multiple key value pairs as values to the parameter of a function. The parameter is denoted with a double asterisk at the front. So what we are trying to say is that a parameter written in the parentheses of a function, if that parameter has a double asterisk at the front, that parameter is a representative of the dictionary class. That's just what we're trying to say. So this my parameter called data is a representative of my dictionary class. Now, because it's a dictionary, you can also add key value pairs like this. So you can see that before the parameter that would be assigned a key, before the parameter that would be assigned an arbitrary keyword argument, before this parameter, you can see that I have four parameters that would be assigned positional arguments. So I have four parameters that would be assigned positional arguments. And you can see that here, those parameters are acting as key and value pairs in that dictionary, which is my fifth parameter. And you can see that, of course, I'm returning back that dictionary. But because this is the proper way to give key value pairs to a parameter, or sorry, this is the proper way to assign arguments to a parameter, you will discover that when we return this dictionary, we are not going to have name and name val as the first key value pair, but instead, we are going to have course and physics as the first key value pair, and we are going to have school and Harvard as the second key value pair before we can now have name Alex and age 34, because I'm returning back the dictionary, which is the fifth parameter in the parentheses. So you just copy your code and run, and you will discover that you're going to have a dictionary that has four key value pairs. You copy it, and then so just comment this one out, comment it out. So execute it, and you will discover that you have a dictionary that has four key value pairs. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So we can see that this is how we can work with a function. Now to recap, if you are to mix a parameter that is assigned a positional argument, and you are to mix a parameter that is assigned a keyword argument, and you are also to mix a parameter that is assigned an arbitrary number of arguments, and you are also to mix a parameter that is assigned an arbitrary keyword argument. Now the order in which I listed them, that is the way you are going to write them. You are not to write the latter ones before the former ones. You are not. So the ones that came after themselves, they are to follow that exact same order in which I listed them. So the positional argument comes first, followed by the keyword argument, followed by the arbitrary number of arguments, and then followed by the arbitrary keyword argument. So these are the conventions that you should know when you are trying to pass parameters to a function and you are trying to assign arguments to those parameters. All right, so that brings us to the end of today's tutorial series, functions, creating user-defined functions. So if you found this video informative, please hit the like button. If you want to encourage me to do more content like this, please subscribe. And if you feel that this video would be of importance to a friend or a family member, please share. All right, thank you. So till next time, have a very great